Before we begin, I'd like to thank the organizers of this panel, the group of the Friends of the Family, and CFAM, Center for Family and Human Rights. And I'd also like to thank Civil Society for the Family for co-sponsoring it. Civil Society for the Family is a group of 180 civil society organizations dedicated to defending and promoting the family here at the United Nations. So thank you. All of us have watched images of children, migrants in crisis, fleeing homes for a better life. Just outside the frame, what you might not see, but we know is there, is a mother, a father, a brother, a sister. In short, everyone we see, all those connected to our work here, are part of a family. Today, we feel it's time to take stock of the effect that migration and urbanization, these two long-lasting, pervasive effects on humanity, have on the family, on mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters. So it is right and it is fitting that we have an august panel of experts here today to talk to us about the effects of migration and urbanization on the family. One of the reasons is, and we'll hear this from experts today, is that the family is the key to rebuilding societies in crisis. It is the key to alleviating poverty, to developing economies, and essentially to the well-being and human flourishing that we all seek. Allow me to introduce our first speaker, who is no stranger to those of us working with the group of the Friends of the Family. Andrei Depkunis is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, but we know him well because from 2004 to 2017, he served as the permanent representative of Belarus to the United Nations. And while in New York, he also served as the president of the executive board of UNICEF, and we'll also be hearing from UNICEF today, and the vice president of ECOSOC. He holds a doctorate in political science from the Belarusian State University, a doctor of research and research fee scholar at the London School of Economics, and speaks many languages. He was born in Minsk, and he's married with 2 children, and we welcome Your Excellency Andrei Depkunis.
Thank you, Susan. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I may speak many languages, but today I'll speak just one language of deep respect for the family. Today, I have a pretty technical assignment of being a loudspeaker to deliver a message from a collective message on behalf of the group of Friends of the Family. But I'm taking this technical assignment with responsibility and gratitude because it's a statement for the noble cause and it's coming from a very honorable group of countries. The group of Friends of the Family unites 25 countries, and they are Bangladesh, Comoros, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Kyrgyzstan, Libya, Malaysia, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, the Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, the Sudan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uganda, Yemen, Zimbabwe, and my own country, Belarus. The group of friends expresses heartfelt thanks to CFAM, our reliable partner, for its dedicated and untiring efforts in promoting the family issues. We also welcome Civil Society for the Family that represents 180 NGOs from all over the world. We count on your continued support to the United Nations member states, and we are ready to strengthen our partnership as a crucial element of success. As we all understand, the family is a pillar of our human life and is vital to everyone, since we all came from a family. In this regard, we believe that we need to stress our focus on promotion and protection of the family. That was the main idea behind creating the group of Friends of the Family in New York. Since its inception, the group of Friends of the Family has been active in a number of thematic events on the family in order to bring to the attention of the United Nations the typicality of this issue and to explore possible solutions. Today we convene another roundtable in the series of the group's events pertaining to the family to discuss major emerging processes in the world such as migration and urbanization that disproportionately affect families. Because of its essential function as a primary educator, economic driver, and social safety net, the family is a basic unit of society, a natural environment for the growth and well-being of all its members, particularly children and young people. In this regard, the protected and successful family is a key to sustainable social and economic development and foundation for strong societies across the globe. Migration has a huge impact on family unity. Entire families often move together, but even more often young men or women migrate in search of secure employment and stability before bringing along members of their families. Long separation sometimes leads to family breakup or father household absence. Urbanization transforms societal demographic structures. It also modifies domestic roles and relations within the family. Cities offer opportunities and represent a higher standard of living not available in the countryside or in small towns. But sometimes advantages cause difficult problems. For instance, cities are difficult places to live in due to health issues resulting from contaminated water and air, severe shortage of housing, psychological problems and stress, crime, violence, and other deviant behavior. All these threats can also have a negative influence on families. We cannot ignore the processes happening around us. In this regard, we should multiply advantages and turn disadvantages into advantages in order to assume our common responsibility within communities for protection and promotion of the well-being of the family. Today, we suggest considering the following questions. How help families to better thrive in modern world and not to harm the children, in particular those on the move? How to make cities sustainable, safe, and friendly towards the family? What actions are needed for speedy and proper family reunification in the context of migration? How to seek and ensure the positive effects of urbanization? What role the United Nations can play in these processes? How the group of friends of the family could contribute in this regard? We look forward to this discussion not just as a means of keeping a topical issue visible, but also as a potential contribution to major processes underway at the United Nations, as well as to the current session of the Commission on Population and Development. End of statement. And if distinguished moderator allows, I would like to say a few words on my own behalf. I looked at how the title of today's roundtable is formulated, and it speaks about the effect of urbanization and migration on the family. I wanted to bring up the aspect of the family being a most important tool for dealing with the challenge, very serious challenge of migration and urbanization in the life of today's society. We all know that the very dramatic value shift is taking place in the world today. And the technological advances in the life of human society, the enormous amount of a strong perception of new opportunities that this technological advancement brings to people creates a certain sense of unusual empowerment that brings to people's minds the idea that they may be much more powerful than they used to be, and the old hooks, roots, boundaries, traditions may be considered as outdated. I don't think that this approach could be considered anywhere close as thoughtful. I understand that there's a strong sense of unanimity in this room about the role of the family, and I would like to invite you to consider the fact that if we want to consider the issues of migration and how we deal with this process in today's world, and in the run-up to the high-level meeting that is going to take place on migration this September, if family is not present in this equation of dealing with migration as a strongest factor, as a critical factor, then we're not getting the right solution for the problem. We may be having a certain idea that people can deal with this problem as individuals, alone. My understanding is that the tradition, the power of tradition that feeds people, that gives strength to people through the structure of the family, through the mechanism of transition of the wisdom of life, the support, spiritual support, physical support, material support that's coming through the family is critical in modern times as it was always in life of human society. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. An excellent way to start us off this morning. Next, I would like to introduce His Excellency Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Arab Republic of Egypt to the United Nations, and also the Chair of the Group of 77, Mohammed Idris. Prior to his appointment as the Ambassador and the PR of Egypt to the UN, he was Assistant Foreign Minister for African Affairs in Cairo from 2015 to 2018. And your illustrious career spans more than 30 years and also served not just as a diplomat, but also as a doctor. So he's very familiar with the human family. He was a resident doctor at the Ministry for Health from 1984 to 1986 before launching his diplomatic career. And he is also married with 2 children. Welcome, Your Excellency, Mohammed Idris.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Susan, and really it's a pleasure to welcome His Excellency Andrei Precariousness and in his new capacity to New York. I had the pleasure of being here while he was here in a previous capacity, but pleased to welcome here him in his new higher responsibilities. And it's an honor, of course, to be with all of you. And it's an honor to be part of this group of the Friends of the Family. I think the family is the unit of a huge structure which is, without it, cannot be built. If you don't, a good family is a good society is a good country is a good world. So without this basis, we cannot go up with the other structures. And allow me also to welcome all of you and to appreciate the presence of the distinguished members of the Friends of the Family in New York and distinguished civil society representatives, and to thank the parent mission of Belarus on behalf of the group of Friends of the Family in New York for convening this very important and timely meeting in the margins of the CPD, the 51st session. And while we are in the middle of the current heated debates on global compact on migration, and apparently the family issues are so much cross-cutting in so many processes which are ongoing now within the United Nations. I would like also to welcome our high-level delegation coming from capitals to attend the CPD 51st. And in this regard, I would like to acknowledge the presence of distinguished delegation from Egypt, Dr. Tariq Tawfiq, the Vice Minister of Health and Population of Egypt, and Dr. Suad Abdelmegid, Head of Population Division at the Ministry of Health and Population in Egypt. Indeed, migration represents a means of an improved standard of living with significant development potential for migrants and their families, especially in the form of economic benefits. An important factor of migration is the family. By the same token, the family traditionally holds a significant force for social cohesion and social development in both countries of origin and destination. According to IOM studies and reports, the reality of migration today poses also other serious challenges to families and their members, especially children. Challenges range from separation of members for long periods, with members of the same family becoming transnational, involving considerable psychosocial implications, to difficulties of integration in countries of destination, and to changes in intra-family gender roles. Actually, I think many of us maybe would remember in old days in our countries when family used to gather, all the family used to gather through the day on breakfasts, lunches, dinners. I think now even family in the same house, they meet quite rarely. They meet each other. They are like accidental tourists within the same house. And we have this phenomenon of what we can say global families now. We find sometimes the father in one place, the mother in another place, the children in a third place. So there is a very deep transformation in the shape and structure and circumstances pertaining to the families. These challenges are being exacerbated in the worldwide context of increasing labor mobility and urbanization. Children are increasingly affected by migration of families, by either being separated from their parents and remaining behind, migrating with their families, or migrating alone. The youth are a category particularly impacted by migration in all the multiple roles inherent in the migration process, as members of families staying behind, as migrating alone, and as migrating with their families. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the Egyptian constitution embraced Egypt's international obligations, among which is the family. Article 10 of the constitution states that family is the basis of society and is founded on religion, ethics, and patriotism. The state of the society have to maintain an authentic character of the Egyptian family and to work on its cohesion, stability, and the protection of its traditions and moral values. The Constitution also adopted the rights of the child, including the right to have an identity and a family or alternative care. Regarding migration, the Egyptian Parliament adopted the first law for combating illegal migration and smuggling of migrants in 2016. A National Coordination Committee for combating illegal migration was established in 2014, and the government started to implement its first national strategy for combating illegal migration over 2016 till 2026. Ladies and gentlemen, women and children are the core of our laws in Egypt, legislation and policies for combating illegal migration. Family reunification is among the most important components of our national strategy. Unaccompanied children who migrate internally from rural to urban areas or cross-border are easy targets for traffickers in persons. Finally, and to have the chance of benefiting from the presence of everyone and enriching the discussion, we believe that the international cooperation should be enhanced in order to protect unaccompanied children. Family-oriented policies should include responsive elements to the specific needs of children and their protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Next, I have the honor to introduce someone from UNICEF. Mr. David Anthony is the Director of Policy and Analytics at UNICEF, and he leads a team that examines the impact of climate and environment, urbanization and migration, and demographics on children. He's an economist who worked for a decade at the Economist Group, leading a team of analysts on global and political economic risks and country analysis. Mr. Anthony also worked for the European Union as a political scientist early in his career and has been a lecturer, a journalist, and an editor. Mr. Anthony earned his master's from the University of London in the UK, and we welcome you and look forward to hearing the perspective of UNICEF. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Children lie at the heart of the family, and the family is critical to childhood. The Convention of the Rights of the Child, which celebrates more or less its 27th birthday this year, states in its preamble that the family is critical to the care and welfare of children, and that children have the right to grow up under the protection and care of a loving family. And we know very well that when the family is fractured or dislocated, childhood comes under threat. For us, families form the first frontier of protection and care for children. And yet, the two forces that we are seeing today of urbanization and migration, though they bring many, many benefits to families, including the prospect of increased prosperity and many times the prospect of asylum and safety, they are also bringing tremendous risk to a number of families. First of all, this starts with internal migration. The migration that often comes from rural to urban areas, where children are left behind as their parents go in support of a better life, a better economy. And many times, this is one of the groups that we in UNICEF feel are not looked at enough, are the children left behind, often in villages, when urbanization and migration takes place. A second group of children that is often made invisible are the children on the move. The children on the move that are unaccompanied and separated from their families. The children on the move that get taken into trafficking. The children on the move that find themselves detained by authorities, often separated from their families, and the children on the move that struggle to be reunited with their families because of insufficient attention to the family in international migration laws and policies. We have an opportunity this year with the two global compacts that we have, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration, to put an end to the idea that kids will have fractured families through the process of migration and displacement. And UNICEF believes that there are four things that we really need to be pressing international leaders to consider as they go about their deliberations. The first one is that wherever a child lives, in a city or in another country, the child must have access to essential quality services of healthcare and education. That is every child's right, irrespective of their country of origin. The second thing that UNICEF believes must happen for every child that is on the move, between internally in their country or externally, is that they must have the protection from exploitation, abuse, and violence. A third request that we have is that all children are not detained by authorities. Detention has deleterious effects on children, and it also is something that ruptures families. So the authorities must take much more care to ensure that families can remain together in safe spaces and that children are not detained. And fourthly, we believe that family unity must be at the heart of international migration policy and of the Global Migration Compact. Making sure that children who are on the move, who are displaced, can be reunited with their families is critical to their well-being and fulfilling their rights under the Convention of the Rights of the Child. excuse me, with these 4 things, UNICEF is pursuing very actively an agenda to persuade and influence the compacts. And we welcome the support of all around the table. We have a group of friends who works on migration, and they are providing stellar support to ensuring that the compacts reflect this agenda. With more than 50 million children on the move, it is critical, and that accounts actually, when you break it down, to 1 in every 200 children is either a refugee, internally displaced, or a migrant. And the numbers are growing. This is critical not only to this compact process, but to the future of our humanity. So I urge you all today to make sure that in these deliberations, whatever we can all do to make sure that as we go through this unique opportunity this year of influencing the international migration agenda, that children remain at its heart and family reunity remains at the heart of giving every migrant and urban child a fair chance in life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think that sets us really up now for the academic portion of our talks, and perfectly for our next speaker, Mr. Scott Lloyd, from the, who is the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement here in the United States. He joined the Office of Refugee Resettlement from the Knights of Columbus, where he served as the Attorney in Public Policy Office. He has worked in private practice in the law and at the Department of Health and Human Services. He's worked on Capitol Hill. And before that, he was an elementary English and social studies teacher before law school. So we're going to have to ask him right here in New York. Okay. And he is the father of 7 children. He lives with his wife in Virginia. And we're welcoming you to hear what's going on with unaccompanied children here in the United States.
Thank you all. Thank you for the organizers of this panel and for the distinguished guests, members of the roundtable. I'm the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is housed in the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for the Children and Families in the U.S. government. And we oversee 3 programs. One is for the repatriation of American citizens who become destitute elsewhere in cooperation with the Department of State. There's also the Refugee Resettlement program where we administer benefits to the refugees that the Department of State has resettled to the United States. And actually, the difficulties with the urban environment is one of the biggest challenges in our refugee, among our refugee populations, because the housing is so difficult to come by, especially when we're settling a family unit. But I wanted to focus my my remarks today on our Unaccompanied Alien Children program, which is a program that was sort of put together according to 3 different legal means. One is a court settlement known as Flores versus Reno from the late 90s. The other is the Homeland Security Act from 2002, and the other is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2008. And those 3 laws provide the legal framework for what happens when a child comes into the United States, lacks legal status in the United States, and their parents are not available. The answer is essentially they become, they come into our office where we are the custodians of those children until a family reunification can take place. And I want to give a few details about what exactly that means. Right now, we're the custodians of any child who's unaccompanied and lacks legal status within the United States, but right now most of those are tending to come across the southern border from the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Those who cross the southern border from Mexico fall under a different legal framework. Our statutory framework kind of gives us the standards by which we're to care for each child. And so what you find is, rather than a detention setting for the unaccompanied alien children program, you find that for the time that they're in our custody, they're in what's essentially a group shelter for youth, where they receive 3 meals a day. They receive education that corresponds with their educational level, which is actually quite a challenge, because we get children who are completely illiterate, and this is the first formal schooling they've ever had, and there are others who are more advanced, and in some instances we're able to cooperate with local school programs to help their educational needs advance. They receive basic health care and medical care, of course, clothing, and they also receive regular weekly case management and clinical services, both in an individualized and a group setting, to help them work with issues that surround family separation and also the difficult journey that many of them made from Central America up through Mexico to the United States. And really, our program really fits in well into the topic today, because this is the story. Our program is a program about families that are experiencing the phenomenon of migration, and really all of the difficulties that attend that situation. And to give you a little bit of context as to what the current picture for our program is, when it first moved from the Immigration and Naturalization Service in 2002 to Office of Refugee Resettlement, we were seeing about 5,000 to 8,000 kids annually, and that trend held until about 2012, where we experienced our first surge, and our population went from about 8,000 to 13,000, which resulted in a backup in border stations where the Customs and Border Patrol could not hand custody over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement in a timely fashion. And that's where you see the pictures of children sleeping on concrete floors and things. You're not going to see that in any of our shelters. In 2013, from 2012, it doubled again to 24,000 for that year. From 2013 to 2014, there was another doubling in our population to 57,496. And 2014 is known within our program as kind of one of the most crucial years for our program, where really the crisis at the border gained global attention, and the programmatic difficulties, really impossibilities that came with 500 UACs crossing the border every day, really led to a sea change in the program, and the amount of resources that we knew that we would have to expend on this population. In 2015, due to efforts of State Department and others, the population went down to 33,000. In 2016, back up to 60,000, but you did not see the border backups because of the programmatic changes that had occurred in the intervening year. And then in 2017, it was back down to I believe it was around 41,000, although those are unreconciled numbers. The most people that UAC that we've ever had in care was in December of 2016, and that was 12,000 children in care at one time, all of them being processed in some form, working on reunification with their family. And right now we have roughly 10,000 beds, and we have 8,500 kids in care. So I have a number of prepared ideas, but what we see in our population is really runs the gamut. But what we see most often is a situation where, for some reason, many times it's It's related to violence, which which is usually related to gangs. When we're talking about Central America, MS-13 is a big concern, and its rival. There's also domestic family violence. So many of the children that we see are fleeing some sort of abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. But also we see family separation that occurs because of economic purposes. And this may be the largest factor that we see, where one parent has left for the United States and the other parent has the children in the country of origin, and at some point, if the UAC becomes old enough, then they're sent to live with the other parent, or if there's a breakdown in the relationship with the living situation in country of origin, it becomes a better idea in the mind of the migrant to go to the United States and reunify with the parent. Between 40 and 50% of our reunifications occur with a parent, and the next largest block is with a family member. So sometimes it may be both parents that are in country of origin sending a UAC to live with a aunt or uncle, cousin, or another sibling who has already left and established themselves in the United States. So the experience of coming across Mexico is one that is usually one that happens to some degree through a smuggling outfit of some sort. We see very often in the case studies or in our case management, the family, in one way or another, has saved up and engaged the services of a smuggling operation for a few $1,000s to shepherd the UAC through Mexico to the southern border, and is able to coach them what to do once they arrive at the border. And what we've seen is that, as we know and as we've hinted at already, they are essentially at the mercy of those smugglers during that long and dangerous trip, and they are prime targets for every sort of brutalization and victimization. And we find that the UAC we receive, many of them have been impressed into gang service, into labor. Or they have been sexually assaulted or violated in some way. And so the trauma that they experience is not only one of family separation and difficult physical rigors, but it is also one of being victimized often on the way to the United States. And so it's our responsibility in that transition between our custody and the custody of the parents to deal with them in a clinical setting, and it can be very difficult. So I was also asked to say a few words about the administration's approach. As we've seen from the historical trends, there is and we are able to bear this out in our interactions with the UAC, that what had been at the beginning of the program a well-intentioned program for a small number of minors who need a reunification with families, it's becoming down south not only a profitable source for smugglers, but it's also becoming in some way, in cultural ways, an option for people who are experiencing people being the children, an option for the children who are experiencing some sort of difficulty to take the risk to come to the United States. And I've asked some of the kids in our program, why would you do this? You knew that this was a dangerous journey. Why would you undertake it? You were at risk of any number of things, and you knew that. And the answer is that in their mind, when they embarked on the journey, they thought that the risks were worth the benefits. But what we've seen from the children who are not lucky enough to get through that journey without being victimized is that many times that turns out not to be the case. And so what we're trying to do as an administration is to improve the legal framework whereby this program can be more focused on those who have legitimate claims for asylum, legitimate claims for special immigrant juvenile status, and those who are embarking on their journey for economic reasons are encouraged to find lawful means of doing so. Because what happens is when we receive them and we release them into a sponsorship setting, unless they have an asylum claim or a SIJ claim, they're really disappearing into the United States in a legal black hole of a sort, which is not something that in the end is a situation where human flourishing can occur, and that person and that family can participate in not only the benefits but also the duties of a society. And so that's been the focus of the administration to this point, and it's been it's a struggle because of our legal framework and the need to work across agencies to kind of create a better framework for these children, but always with the goal in mind of recognizing the human dignity of each child that comes into our care, the dignity of the family that we're hoping to reunify them with, and the dignity of the American taxpayers who are also providing these services for these unaccompanied children. And so the onus is on us to really improve that situation so that the children who most need the services that we provide are able to get them when they need them. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And it's clear that you also feel very deeply the weight of what you're charged to do, being the legal custodian of these unaccompanied minors. I had no idea of the numbers. You know, one of the things you said that sometimes, obviously, migration breaks up families, but it's also sometimes family breakdown that is driving migration, right? And so this is a point that both Your Excellencies made in your introductory remarks, and it's something that our next speaker is going to be addressing, which he has spent many years researching. Dr. Timothy John Nelson is a lecturer at Princeton University in the Department of Sociology and the author of numerous articles on low-income fathers, and the co-author with Catherine Eden of the book Doing the Best I Can, Fatherhood in the Inner City, published in 2013 at University of California Press. His research has focused on African American religion and congregational studies. He has several books and articles on fatherlessness of urbanization. We look forward to hearing about that. His PhD in sociology is from the University of Chicago. He's taught at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Northwestern, and the University of Pennsylvania, and we're really honored that you're here today to share your wisdom with us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's an honor to be with you, and in the way that I understand my time with you is to really give you a report on the state of the family in urban America. And I guess I did the typical academic thing of doing a PowerPoint, but it'll be painless, I think. But really, this is a tale of two societies. So for the college-educated in the United States, family life has never been better. Although people are waiting longer to get married, those unions are more stable than they have been in decades. Also, it's still a fairly rare event for people to have children outside of marriage if you have a college degree. However, for a large part of the non-college educated urban families, the situation is getting much worse. And so in the time that I have today, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on sort of for this lower educated population. So to give you the punchline up front, the story is one of two things: really increasing instability among low-income urban families, increasing complexity in terms of family structure and family formation of low-income urban families. I'll talk a little bit about the reason behind these trends. And although it's overall not a heartening story, I think there are some causes for hope, in some unexpected places that I think we can leverage to make things better for these families. So I am a qualitative researcher, and so I've done interviews with fathers. My co-author, who's also my spouse, by the way, Catherine Eden, has done lots of interviews with low-income mothers. And yes, you can write a book with your spouse and live to tell about it afterwards. But we've interviewed, so the book, Doing the Best I Can, which is based on interviews with African-American and white fathers in Camden, New Jersey, and Philadelphia, is part of a larger project of 438 fathers in Charleston, South Carolina, and 2 cities in Texas. And so that's the data I'm drawing on. Also, in terms of a larger picture of urban families, I'll be talking about some data from the Fragile Families Project out of Princeton University, which represents almost 5,000 children born in major U.S. cities. And those children were just interviewed. They turned 15 a few years ago. So this is a longitudinal look at lower income families, and this data set represents a large swath of unmarried parents. Okay, so you probably can't see this, but this is a chart showing births to unmarried parents growing across all racial groups. I don't have a slide showing the educational disparities here, but they are what I told you. Really, the dividing line is between the college educated and the non-college educated. And the relationships of American cohabitors are very unstable. This is unlike patterns that you see in Europe, where you have very stable cohabiting relationships where people spend decades together, have children together, and so on. American cohabitations are extremely fragile. This is from Fragile Families data. By the time that a child born into a non-marital union turns 5, the majority of those relationships have dissolved. Some have become married, some are still cohabiting, but it's a very unstable situation. And this table, chart, which you probably can't see, shows the number of new relationships that either the father or the mother have entered into by the time the child turns 5. So that's the total. We also have this broken down by father's new romantic relationships, by total parental relationships, mother's relationships. So there's a lot of turbulence in these types of situations, right? And not only are these relationships unstable, but they lead to a lot of family complexity. So when couples break up, they repartner quite quickly, and some of that is due to economic pressures. You need another income to help, in an urban environment. And so the moms and dads often go on to new relationships, have children in those new relationships. Those are also unstable. They go on to further relationships. As you can imagine, this creates extremely complex family structures. So here's just kind of a stick figure representation of a couple that's had a child together, the focal child in the Fragile Families relationship. Then they've broken up, found new partners, had children in those relationships, often bringing in prior children from other romantic relationships as well. And so you can see very quickly that these become extremely complex family structures. And for all we know about, children are resilient, but we really don't know the developmental effects of having that many parental figures cycling through at very early ages, something that we sometimes call the father go-round effect here. So these just show you the amount of half-siblings that the children born into these unions have by their 5th birthday, and it's quite significant, okay? And so children are experiencing the instability of their parents in terms of their romantic relationships, and also complexity. And so you can see that a large proportion of children born to unmarried parents experience both instability and complexity by their 5th birthday. Now, I just want to point out, if you can see it, the little green slice of the pie there, only 4% of these children are what we would call in a stable single mother family. In other words, there's been no new romantic relationships and no new children. And so this is why my wife often says, in context, like, she can probably get away with it more than I can, but she'll emphasize there are no single mothers the way that we think about single mothers. There's always a father, a partner in the picture. Policy has to take into account that reality, okay? All right, so what percentages are we talking here? Well, now 40+% of all births in the U.S. are to unmarried parents, right? So we're talking about a very large portion of the population. Nearly 8 in 10 of these are either unstable or complex, and nearly half are experiencing both instability and complexity, okay? So these are not small figures. Now, so that's kind of the overview. What I do is go out and interview fathers and sit down and talk to them, sometimes for hours on end, get kind of the deep background of their family background, their histories of jobs and relationships and so on. And so I'll just give you a little bit of window into, why are we seeing these patterns? What's kind of driving some of this? Well, first of all, I call this courtship in quotation marks because there's really no good word for this. But when low-income urban men and women get together, and that's often a very undefined sort of thing, the mean time before a conception happens, which leads to a live birth, is about 6 months between meeting and this happening. And often it's a very ill-defined relationship. They may be seeing other people, but the conception seems to galvanize the relationship. And it's like, oh, we have a child coming. We better get things together for the sake of the baby. At this point, they often move in together. He'll get a job or a better job, or decide it's time to kick that drug habit or whatever. So there is kind of a mobilization to try to form a family unit, right? Not marriage necessarily, but some sort of stability. And they're very optimistic about their chances that they can make this work. And when the child is born, the Fragile Families finds these couples in the hospital and asks them about, what do you think is going to happen in the future? And often these couples are very optimistic that, oh, we're going to be together, we'll eventually get married, things are looking good. They call this kind of the magic moment. But that optimism is often very much overshooting the mark. Here's just some language about some of these courtships. I won't have. But what's interesting, and I think this is kind of one of the most surprising things that we found, and really goes against the idea of who the fathers in particular are. The narrative of these fathers is really, the larger narrative is that, oh, they don't care about children, they just want to, have sex and get women pregnant, but as soon as she comes up pregnant, they're out of there. This, we found, was completely not the case. These men want to become fathers. I know it sounds crazy, and it sounds crazy to them because they recognize, like, I'm in no place to bring a child in the world, but there's not a lot of motivation to hold off on that. Often there's not a lot going on in their lives that is positive, and the thought that I'm going to be a father really brings some hope and some positivity into, it kind of gives them a reason to get themselves together. So they're very excited about the prospect of becoming fathers. So these are just some things in the interview that were said about the happiness and the overwhelming acceptance of bringing children into the world that these men, and it's interesting, men are more excited about the prospect of the pregnancy than the women are. Maybe the women are more realistic about some of the challenges, right? So that's some. But again, they can't quite escape the reality that these children are being born in extremely precarious circumstances. These are unstable relationships. The couple hasn't really known each other. Since they found out about the pregnancy, it's all been kind of getting ready for the baby. And then the reality hits, the child is born, and there's just so many obstacles against them. Generations ago, we used to have the shotgun marriage, in which an unmarried couple was pressured to become married at the birth of a child. This is ancient history in these areas. In fact, often the families of these individuals are against them getting married. It's like, what are you with him for? He's no good. Why are you with her? How do you know that baby's yours? So there's very little keeping people together in this situation. All right, so there's very little glue holding these children together. So those are the countervailing forces. So relational instability, family complexity is the reality. They break up, but what is the deeper picture? Are these fathers able to maintain relationships with their children over time, even after the breakup? And to what extent is this happening? On the one hand, it doesn't look good. This is father-child contact in the past month, by years since the romantic relationship ended. So that you can see it every year. There's pretty steep drop-off in how fathers are being able to maintain connection with their children. But that's kind of masking a more complex reality. So I was going to tell you about David Williams' family. So David has had 2 teenage children with ex number 1. These are kids that he rarely sees, although he bumps into them sometimes. He also has 2 children with another ex-girlfriend. Those children he doesn't see at all. He's lost complete contact with them. But now David's together with Deborah. They have a child together. He is so excited about this baby and the chance to do fatherhood right now, because he's messed up before. And so he sees this really as a way to redeem himself as a father. Deborah brought 2 children from a previous relationship into the union, and he plays social father to those kids. He treats them just like his own child. So we could say David's a terrible father to the older kids, but he's a great father to the younger kids, right? It's a very complex situation. And this is what we see in the larger data. So we ask fathers, for all of your children, who are the ones that you're most involved with? And most involved means either weekly or daily contact. And this represents the 2 bars of fathers with no complexity or complexity in their family. So the fathers are involved with their children more so than the other chart would show, but that's for the most involved. For the least involved, where they have no contact or maybe see once a year, those children are really missing out, right? So part of what's driving this is that when these unstable couples break up, and then he finds it very hard to stay in contact with some of the children, he is enough oriented toward becoming a father that he wants to try again in a new relationship, right? So thinking about all of these dynamics, we've thought, well, what are some of the best sort of intervention points for this? There's been a lot of success in talking to young women about waiting to bear children and to have families. So the rate of teenage childbearing has gone down and so on. So we think, given that that men are very much a part of the picture here, there should be a targeted approach for young men. And because men and women really are motivated by some of the same things about the desire to parent and to have a child, part of what's driving that is a lack of any other kind of positive thing to be engaged in, especially in these inner city neighborhoods. So really, kind of really taking the fathers and giving them a vision for a future that allows them to wait, to have the motivation to wait, and so on. And then the final thing is, once these couples do have children together, what can we do to kind of really solidify that family unit so that they don't break up and then seek to have children in other sort of partnerships? And I think one thing that our research has really uncovered is that the men really want to be parents. They've kind of really rejected the old style of, what it means to be a good father is just to be a financial provider. They have really taken on a lot of the mothering role and the nurturing role. So to really value that, in terms of child support, often guys are slapped with child support orders, but they're not allowed visitation. And so to really adjudicate both of those things together, to give him access to his child, obviously looking out for concerns of domestic violence, and then really to treat these as families and not just look at the children and the mothers, but to recognize that there are fathers who want to be involved and to facilitate that as much as possible. All right, so I'll leave that. So those are some of the hopeful things to work on in sort of the larger narrative of what's happening here.
Thank you, Professor Nelson. Really informative, and I think the quote of the day is honor men as fathers and not just paychecks. But you know, it sounds funny, but it's true. We spend a lot of time talking about the dignity of women and children, and we need to talk about the dignity of men and fathers and families. And so thank you for your research. Before I introduce our next speaker, I want to say thank you to the Office of the President of the General Assembly, whose office is represented here, and your presence really is a testament to how important this is. So thank you. Our next speaker is Stefano Generini, my colleague from the Center for Family and Human Rights. He's the Director of Legal Studies. He researches and writes on international law and policy and advises UN delegations, so many of you are very familiar with Stefano. And he's been very active in the press lately, and on Twitter you can find him at Pro-Life Advocate. He has a JD from Notre Dame, and he lives in New Jersey with his wife and his 4 children. And where's Stefano? Stefano, please.
Thank you, Susan. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sort of a legal angle on this whole discussion of migration and urbanization, because there's quite a lot of good international law as well as policy addressing specifically the issue of the family in the context of migration and urbanization. And we find ourselves at a very key moment in negotiations with the Global Compact for Migration being negotiated, just coming off of the 2030 agenda and the Habitat 3 negotiations. And so we find ourselves really at a time where we really have to make sure that the family gets included in the UN agenda. And we're at a key moment, and we've got, aside from the situation with displaced persons, the refugee situation, migrants, with many, many millions more, we are witnessing a huge movement of people with urbanization, as we saw, and with all the ensuing complications for families from that, the family complexity that Professor Nelson was bringing up is simply amazing. And we really need strong leadership here at UN headquarters, and we are really hopeful for that the group of Friends of the Family will continue to do it. Many of the delegations here on, represented in this room who have historically been protectors and defenders of the family internationally, and we're looking forward to that leadership for many, many years to come, because it is a struggle that will last years. It's not something only in the short term. And so I just want to briefly bring up some of the main aspects of UN policy which do already address family reunification as well as family policy in the context of urbanization quickly, and then go into a little bit of international law, more technical, if you like, or philosophical even. So with regard to family reunification, we have some excellent language in the New York Declaration of Migrants, which was recently agreed. Talks about family reunification in the context of migration and refugees, as well as in the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework that's an appendix to the New York Declaration on Migrants. Family unity is one of the priority considerations that states, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, have to consider in designing policies for the reception and admission of refugees. And this is fundamental, and it has to carry forward into the Global Compact for Migration. Here are some of the elements that are already being negotiated in the Global Compact: family reunification, the issue of unaccompanied migrants and children separated during migration, as well as the importance of keeping contact between families and migrants. And in the age of social media, it seems very difficult that to have any justification for not allowing contact between families. And we also see in the urban agenda of the United Nations, we've seen historically a lot of excellent focus on the family, beginning with Habitat, the original Habitat Conference, but also in the 1990s with Habitat 2. Very strong language on how cities must take into account the constructive role of the family in the design, development, and management of settlements. Very strong language here about the importance of the family, including facilitating necessary conditions for the integration, reunification, preservation, improvement, protection within adequate shelter, access to basic services, and a sustainable livelihood. This is all language that really emphasizes the importance of taking into account the family in urban planning. Sadly, in the Habitat 3, we weren't able to get that same emphasis, but we did get a little bit of a kicker there with about having cities that are friendly, at least to families in some ways, at least in the context of green spaces. But here I want to talk a little bit about the issue. So why is it so hard to talk about the family, in UN policy? You see the we're jumping from Habitat 2 in 1996, where you have this very strong language, focus on the family, and you move forward to 2016, and it's becoming a lot more difficult. And part of it is we seem to be very forgetful of what international law already says about the family. International law already provides a framework to talk about the family that should be underpinning all our efforts towards family reunification policies, programming, as well as human settlements, planning. But there's a lot of forgetfulness. And the forgetfulness begins very often inside, the Secretariat building, sadly. So here you have a report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that says things like this. There is no definition of the family in international law. International standards do not prescribe a specific concept of family. The family should be understood in a wide sense. So you have all these statements. If we have a problem with fake news in the modern world, here at the UN we have a problem with fake law, and this is fake law. Things like the equivalence of a variety of arrangements to provide and care for children, or the equivalence of the nuclear family, the extended family, other traditional and modern community-based arrangements. To say that everything is equivalent. And this was not always the case. The Secretariat would have never dared to write something like that, I'm sure, even only 20 years ago. This is not to be unfairly critical. It's simply a matter of forgetfulness, and it's because of many of the trends in some of the member states. And there's sort of a forgetfulness of what we've all agreed at the United Nations and what should be really the common language that brings us all together to address family issues internationally. It wasn't like that in the beginning, let me tell you. In 1948, when the United Nations was founded, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was agreed, there was a much clearer understanding of what the family is and how important it was, not only for societies, but for the international project, the United Nations project, and the Human Rights Project, even more in particular. Here is the mural in the Security Council that many of you have seen, but many of you may have never actually noticed or looked at in detail. Here, life and death decisions over the lives of millions of people are taken every day throughout the year. And this mural was painted by a Norwegian artist, and he obviously read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter, and he said, I'm going to depict what the new world order, the new order of the world that is emerging with this new institution, the United Nations. The world had just escaped global conflict. You have the world in darkness in the front, slavery, oppression, darkness, and in the background you see the new world emerging with jubilation, the blue flags representing the United Nations, scenes of development, peace, prosperity, and a world full of hope. And at the center of it all, at the keystone of it all, is a vignette representing the family. If here's a detail, it's very clearly the family. The family also, even you can go as far as even to say that it's marriage. You know, you've got a man and a woman on their knees with a bouquet of flowers, children, and the amazing thing is that the artist superimposed this central vignette with the phoenix, which is at the heart of the picture. So the family is the phoenix. The family is a unit, the natural and fundamental group unit of society that regenerates society and that can regenerate the world. This is a fantastic image. Now, the artist was not a lawyer, but he read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. And it also talks about the equal right of men and women to freely marry and found a family. And this provision of international law is incorporated in just about every major human rights treaty that has been negotiated since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Even the CEDAW Convention speaks of husband and wife in the context of the family. And why is it so important to talk about a definition of the family? I got a lot of pushback over it. This is how we talk about the family with the group of the Civil Society for the Family, the group of organizations that we launched here at UN headquarters in 2016 to promote the family internationally. And one of the things that we saw was one of the things that makes it hard to talk about the family is that we don't know what we're talking about many times, especially with the complexity and the different family forms that are emerging everywhere. But in order to facilitate conversations about immigration policy, which is already a very sensitive topic politically, in order to talk about urbanization, we really should be talking about what we already have in common, what we already agreed on in international law. And this is, if anything, if there's ever one of those principles of international law that should be argued has become customary, the idea of the family as the natural fundamental group unit of society, it certainly is one. And, you've got 111 Constitution at least reflecting this very verbiage from these multiple international treaties. And so even if the framers of the Human Rights Project did not intend perhaps this language as a formal definition of the family, it certainly should be considered at least a functional definition of the family for purposes of the policies. For when we talk about family reunification in the context of migration or in the context of providing housing for families, what are we talking about when we talk about family internationally? And here we have a foundation for our conversation. And if we don't have this, this is what Peter Kroc, I think, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but the artist who painted the Security Council mural, he described it as the work of the UN and the Security Council will provide the seeds for a new and more valuable life. And in the context of the recent refurbishment of the whole United Nations complex, the chief architect who oversaw the renovations, this is one of the things he talked about. How sensitive changing anything here at the UN is. He says, if you change this, where is that going to lead us? Now, he was talking about the external aspect of the Security Council, but we can also apply this to the actual norms that we're talking about. And if we look at that multiplicity of instruments that talk about the family, we can identify a center core of rights throughout, a lineage going all the way back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, beginning with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the preamble, which is the Declaration on the Rights of the Child from 1959. recognizing the family as the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all its members, not just children, but all its members, and particularly children, as well as the context, the right of the child to know and be cared for by his or her parents, which is ultimately the root in which the principle of family reunification is based in the case of children. The prior right of parents to educate their children in accordance with their convictions, the right to cultural and religious identity that was already brought up. All of these are core rights that need to be recognized and predicated in all UN policies and also domestic policies dealing with migration and urbanization. And in particularly in the context of migration, which is a very politically sensitive issue, it's so important to really stay faithful to what we already agreed. Here's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified UN treaty, and you have an exception to the principle even of complete sovereign prerogatives on migration issues, which is a really strong thing if you think about it, because if there's one issue where sovereignty or sovereign prerogatives are at their apex, migration is one of them, and that's recognized universally, right? But here we have an exception to that in the obligation of states to provide positive, humane, and expeditious procedures for family reunification, as well as limits on what states may do in limiting the movement of people across borders. Why? Because the principle of reuniting children with their family, with the natural family, is so important. And so with the natural family or their equivalents, including adoptive families, including also complex situations like, children with multi-generational homes, all of these are equivalent and analogous to the family as understood in international law. We have this in the context of the Convention on the Protection of Rights of All Migrant Workers, which is not widely ratified, but at the same time here we have a agreed language that the United Nations General Assembly adopted. It's certainly not widely ratified. It's not seen as binding, but it's certainly seen as embodying important principle. And including, in many ways, speaking about the family and family reunification as rooted in, as understood in international law, also helps us to move beyond the sensitive political issues like the issue of chain migration. Here in the United States, it's become, you talk about chain migration, and it seems like you want to abolish all kind of migration between families, but we have in international law already a common language about what we mean by family reunification. We're not talking about chain migration. We're talking about reuniting families, which is very, very important. And so this is where I just want to leave us here, this fantastic, beautiful image from the Security Council, and that we hope that really, in many ways, it really represents still for us the destination we want for the United Nations and the destination we want for the family and for our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. So the cure for forgetfulness is the family as the phoenix. Very good. Next, I would like to introduce to you a representative from the Holy See Mission to the United Nations, Tim Herman. Before I do that, I just want to recognize that I know that Professor Tarek Toflik is going to be taking over for the PR of Egypt, who has to leave us. And we thank you for being here. Professor, we welcome you also to join us here, and we thank Egypt for your support for the panel as well. So, Tim Herman is an attaché at the Holy See Mission. He's a Fulbright scholar, educated in the U.S., in Latin America, and Europe, with international experience working in both the UN and abroad in Latin America. He's experienced in foreign policy, diplomacy, and international advocacy. His master's degree is in international affairs, where he studied in Milan, and he has a bachelor's degree in political science from UC Berkeley, and that's where, when I met him, he was, I think, a sophomore at UC Berkeley. So he looks young, but he's been at this a very long time. He's fluent in Spanish and Italian and conversational Portuguese. You can test him in that later. And first, I think we're gonna show a movie from the Holy Father, and then we're gonna follow with Tim's talk.
Le migrazioni nelle loro diverse forme non rappresentano certo un fenomeno nuovo nella storia dell'umanità. Esse hanno marcato profondamente ogni epoca, favorendo l'incontro dei popoli e la nascita di nuove civiltà. Purtroppo in gran parte dei casi si tratta di spostamenti forzati causati da conflitti, disastri naturali, persecuzioni, cambiamenti climatici, violenze, povertà estrema e condizioni di vita indegne. La nostra comune risposta si potrebbe articolare attorno a 4 verbi: accogliere, proteggere, promuovere e integrare. Accogliere. Un'accoglienza responsabile e dignitosa di questi nostri fratelli e sorelle comincia dalla loro prima sistemazione in spazi adeguati e decorosi. Proteggere. Parliamo di milioni di lavoratori e lavoratrici migranti e tra questi particolarmente quelli in situazione irregolare, di profughi e richiedenti asilo, di vittime della tratta. La difesa dei loro diritti inalienabili, la garanzia delle libertà fondamentali e il rispetto della loro dignità sono compiti da cui nessuno si può esimere. Promuovere. Proteggere non basta, occorre promuovere lo sviluppo umano integrale di migranti, profughi e rifugiati. La promozione umana dei migranti e delle loro famiglie comincia dalle comunità di origine. Là deve essere garantito, assieme al diritto di poter migrare, anche il diritto di non dover migrare. Integrare. L'integrazione, che non è né assimilazione né incorporazione, è un processo bidirezionale che si fonda essenzialmente sul mutuo riconoscimento della ricchezza culturale dell'altro. Credo che coniugare questi 4 verbi in prima persona singolare e in prima persona plurale rappresenti oggi un dovere.
There we go. Thank you very much. First, thank you to Susan for the nice introduction. And it's funny, actually, it's wonderful to be here and to speak today about our work, especially on the global compacts and the 20 action points of the Holy Father, which were presented here. But I just want to start by saying my very first experience at the UN was back in 2007 with CFAM. I was an intern at 6. This is 12 years ago. And that was the first time I saw the Holy See. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be a beautiful thing to have the opportunity to work for the Vatican here at the UN? And then it happened. So here I am. It's kind of fun to come full circle. I'd also like to thank His Excellency Minister Dapikunis for being here with us today, for your remarks. Ambassador Edris, who's now left, and his representative and distinguished colleagues, thank you very much for everything. The remarks are extremely helpful. I also want to just pay a special thanks to our friend from UNICEF here, because throughout the compacts and the negotiation of the compacts, the honest truth is that the positions that we've taken on the family and also in relationship to children have largely come from the good work that you've done with the group of friends of the family and child protection. So I want to thank you guys in particular for that. And in general, I'd like to thank the group of friends of the family for having me here today and for the civil society representatives that are with us to come and allow us to present on the effect of urbanization and migration on the family. As you saw, we just presented the 20 points. The 20 points were our effort to, after the New York Declaration, to really think about how to best approach migration policy, broadly speaking. We knew that both the compacts were coming, both the compact on refugees and also on migrants, and we desperately wanted to infuse both with best practices coming from the ground, right? So people who are actually at the ground level, civil society in particular, that are implementing the policies that we know the international community needs to refer to as a framework. And the 20 points are essentially that. We sat down over a 2-year period with civil society, including faith-based organizations, but a lot of other implementers, including states and even different community leaders, to get a good idea of what would really work, how we could really put together a framework that would work, how we could even put a framework together that would recognize what we're already doing, essentially. But first, I want to start a little bit from the way that the church understands these things. And I think the best way to do that is by quoting Pope Pius XII. And here you understand the way that the church sees the family, but especially the migrant. And I'll just read the quote because it's powerful and it's very helpful for us to understand what I'm going to present today. The émigré Holy Family of Nazareth fleeing into Egypt is the archetype of every refugee family. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, living in exile in Egypt to escape the fury of an evil king, are for all times and all places the models and protectors of every migrant, alien, and refugee of whatever kind who, whether compelled by fear, persecution, or by want, is forced to leave his native land, his beloved parents and relatives, his close friends, and to seek a foreign soil. What I like about this quote is that you understand, at least from our perspective, but I think the experience of everyone, that migrants and refugees are first and foremost human beings that come from a family. And they're typically leaving a situation of dire distress or even conflict and persecution. And these are real people with real stories who are in desperate need of our attention. And we think that's the best way of framing this debate that often is lost in policy, even if policy is essential to the conversation. The Holy See in migration. We have a long history, very long history working in these things. That quote, for example, is really the result of the millions of refugees after World War II that were foisted into a lot of foreign soil and cross borders to countries that had never really dealt with such a large displacement before. That's where we get the 1951 Convention on Refugees from. The 67 Protocol comes later, but that 51 Convention is really a response to the massive amount of displacement that we saw following World War II that particularly fell on the Europeans to address. There were stranded people that the Pope, specifically at that time, Pope Pius XII, said needed to have for every country, including the Vatican actually, which received a number of refugees, although it's not very well known, but over 5,000. He appealed at that moment on the behalf of the generosity of all men and women, but especially Catholics, to have an open-door policy in every country for these people in need of support. But from early on, even before Pope Pius XII, I'd like to pay particular attention to Pope Leo XIII, which is really where we get our first understanding of the migrant, and it was always associated with the family. I want to emphasize that. In Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII, and we have a number of encyclicals, and that's kind of seen as a social policy of the church. You can always look to them for that. So Pope Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum. It's on the condition of labor, is what it means in English. And he established the right of persons to work and to survive to support a family. You have to understand that economic systems, no matter what they are, whether they be or on the capitalist bent or socialist or something heterodox, the market economy tends to displace families. It makes it difficult for families often to provide, especially if they're not able to participate fully. And there's a number of reasons why not every family or every person is able to participate fully in the economy. But it can be very difficult on families. It can be a situational difficulty, so one in which a country's economy is not good enough or a local economy is not good enough for a person to support their family, or there can be outside factors as well as personal factors. But the point of the Holy Father in this encyclical was to point out the right to be able to take care of your family. And if you can't, to seek another job or to move your location in order to do that. And from that is where our delegation, when we speak in the global compacts and negotiate, has pushed and promoted this idea of the right to remain, or put in other words, the right not to immigrate. We think, first and foremost, and this is found in the New York Declaration, is also now in 2 different places in the Global Compact, and will likely remain there as well, that first, before this right to immigrate, right, which we also support, so exactly coming from this first conception in Rerum Novarum, and the need for someone to be able to take care of their family, there's first the right to be able to stay where you are and to provide for your family in that place, recognizing that it's better to stay. It's almost always better to stay. As we've heard from many of our presenters today, at the moment of someone makes the decision to migrate, it's a difficult decision. And what often happens is that someone leaves before the rest of the family comes with them or arrives later. That does break apart a family, even if it's for a short period of time. It makes it very difficult, not only on the children, but on the larger family, more generally speaking. So for us, that's a very important thing that we'll begin to speak about. Then I could go through a number of other popes and what they've done, but it's also important just to point out quickly that Benedict XV, and this was following World War I, he was the first one to put together a discourse called the World Migrant Day discourse, which has now been going for 104 years. So the church has been very engaged, and that's a discourse that we still deliver. The Holy Father delivered one in January, and we always address kind of the current global situation of migrants. Pope Francis is no stranger, as you know, to the situation of migrants and to the need to address their situation. He founded what is now known as the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, and he combined the work of a number of our other pontifical councils. The best way to think of this from the Vatican perspective and in the kind of international governance is that these are like our line ministries, and many line ministries were brought into one particular ministry that looked to promote the well-being of humans and human beings, broadly speaking, and not take a siloed approach, but a more holistic approach. I mention that dicastery because underneath that dicastery, there's a specific section called the Migrants and Refugees section that deals with all issues concerning migrants and those in need. The 20 points, like I was saying, while they came from civil society and a number of important conversations with civil society, were then brought on board by the Holy See as official policy. So everything that we do within the global compacts is related to the 20 points. These I will go over now, kind of not one by one, but to give you kind of a broad overview, which the Holy Father in the video also did a very good job of doing, obviously. But they're practical proposals for policy, policies that are already working and that are already in place among the 193 countries that are represented by this august body, or represented in this august body, rather. They have 4 general titles, so there's 20 points under each of these titles, essentially. So each title has 5 to 6 points. Welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. Those words are action words, and they also follow the migrant along his journey, okay? They're the foundation for the 20 action points, and again, they were first delivered in the World Migrant Day Address, which this year was on the Feast of the Assumption. To welcome, the first point. This is about enhancing safe and legal channels for migrants and refugees, and here the key message is that migration should be safe, legal, and orderly. It should also be voluntary, and this goes back to that point on the right to remain. There is a real need to pay attention to development and to make sure that families and migrants and individuals, before they make the decision to cross a border, have what they need in their country of origin. That's what makes migration sustainable. It's what makes it a voluntary decision and not an act of desperation. But as we know, that's not always the case. I show you this slide just to give you a sense of what the points actually look like. So you see, here's to welcome. It says exactly what I've already told you. But then it goes into these practical steps and practical points, very similar actually to the Global Compact. We like to think we had some sort of influence there. To protect, this is about ensuring migrants and refugees' rights and dignity. Here, the church insists on the importance of taking a holistic and integrated approach with a focus on the centrality of persons. Migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees should be received as human beings first, in dignity and full respect for the human rights, regardless of status. Second, to promote. This is about advancing migrants and refugees' integral human development. Again, this idea of a holistic approach to development, not just focusing on what it means to receive or necessarily, what a good policy is in terms of, I don't know, even just access to basic services, but looking at what it takes to actually allow for someone to flourish in a new society. Here we like to talk about assuring structures which allow those staying long-term in particular to develop as human beings and to contribute to the development of the host country, keeping in mind that a well-integrated migrant is also a good citizen. And typically migrants and refugees, the surprising thing is, as many low-skilled as there are also a number of many high-skilled and highly educated who fall through the cracks because the system isn't capable of receiving them and seeing them first as people rather than migrants. To integrate, this is about enriching communities through wider participation of migrants and refugees. And here we always emphasize that it's a two-way process. Now, there's the responsibility to respect the values and traditions and laws of the community for us, which comes first. That means the migrant also has a duty and a responsibility to the community that receives them. Just like any of us when we go to a home for the first time or the second time, or if our own families take us in or our own friends, there's a certain respect and a gratitude that comes with that, right? But there's also on the other side the acknowledgement of the beneficial contribution which those migrants who are new to our communities can make to the whole community. And we think both sides are crucial but often ignored because in the conversation of the Global Compact, many of you know this already, but we often tend on one side or the other. So we only want to talk about reception, or we only want to talk about when someone leaves their country, and there's no real conversation about the 360-degree approach that we're trying to take now in the Global Compact, right? It's not just about integration, it's also about development at home, it's also about respect for human rights at home, and it's also about once someone arrives, the need to truly pay attention both to what the host community is providing, but also to the needs of the migrant that arrives. Here's this last part of the presentation is just to explain the connection between the 20 points, which I recommend reading. Obviously, we don't have time today to go through each of them, but they've been, at least for our delegation, they've been quite crucial in engaging in a serious way in the Global Compacts. But I want to make the connection between those points and the family. Again, I want to go over this point of the right to remain. This means addressing the drivers that create and exacerbate large movements. You'll see a number of practical policies in the 20 points that address, first and foremost, the country of origin, which lead and contribute to large movements. There's many factors, what we call adverse drivers, that we need to address. And that means that the international community together, right, not just the countries of origin, but also destination and transit, need to create conditions that allow for communities and individuals to live in peace, prosperity, and security in their homelands. Migration should be a choice, not a necessity. This comes from the New York Declaration. This is something that we're very proud of. Our delegation has always supported this point. It's actually present, believe it or not, in ICPD as well, in dealing with migration. It's always been part of the migration debate, and we think it's fundamental. But also the right to family unity, which was spoken to by a number of our presenters here today. And there's universal consensus on this, that the family is not only the fundamental group unit of society, but it's entitled to respect, protection, assistance, and support. The right to marry and found a family also includes the right to maintain a family life together. I put this next to the right to remain because that's exactly what we're talking about. What does it take for a family to stay together, not only in transit and in a country of destination through various policies that be put in place, but also in countries of origin? There are a number of policies that make it difficult for families to stay together, and that leads to migration. And so we need to address them holistically on both sides. Lastly, the right to access basic social services as part of the right to life. All migrants, as a matter of human dignity and their fundamental human rights, are entitled to access basic social services, including access to health care, education, justice, and adequate housing or shelter, regardless of their migratory status. This is especially the case for migrant families and their children, as well as migrants in the most vulnerable of situations, like pregnant mothers, the elderly, and migrants with disabilities. I think that, we have to be honest with ourselves that the provision, for example, of basic services is a human rights obligation that states have first to their own citizens, but also to those that have crossed their borders. This was clearly defined in the ICCPR, the SESCR, and also UDHR. So it's not only a matter of good migration policy. I think that's really for us what the 20 points want to point out. This isn't just about good migration policy. It's also about state obligation to fulfill the rights of the individual and also to respect their human dignity. That's good policy at home. It's also good policy abroad. That said, we recognize that states provide these services and fulfill these rights in a discretionary way. But the point is that either way, they have an obligation to fulfill them, and they must do so adequately. We don't pretend that irregular migrants, for example, are going to receive the same services that perhaps a citizen does, or a refugee for that matter. But we do recognize that there's a basic level of services that must be provided, including education, adequate shelter, health care, access to justice, things like this, that everybody deserves no matter their situation. And especially I want to point out that someone in a regular situation is actually the most vulnerable. They're the ones with the least protections. And that's why human rights law exists and humanitarian law exists specifically to protect those individuals. It remains, I know, the biggest point of contention in the global compacts, but it should be the center of a human approach to migration, and especially any approach to the migrant family, which must have access to these services, not only to survive, but also if they're eventually going to be returned in dignity to their countries of origin. The last thing that I'll say is that one of the most important things for the global compacts is an attention to reality. And I want to thank both civil society but also member states for the honest conversation that's going on right now and for the role that we've been allowed to play in really thinking through what it means to address migration in a holistic way. It's not an easy conversation, but I think that we also need to keep in mind that the Global Compact on Migration for the first time is allowing states to speak about what migration policy in their countries actually looks like, which is a huge deal. We have a refugee framework, but we don't have a migration framework, and that's because, as Stefano pointed out, it really touches the most controversial or difficult, sensitive area, which is state sovereignty. But states do manage migration, and the beauty of the compact is now we can talk about how they already do that, and we can talk about the common areas in which we agree, and those areas where we don't, but where we need to do work. For us, that's why the 20 points are there. We try and find the best way to bridge those gaps, and we're sincerely thankful for having that opportunity today, but also in the conversation around the compacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Holy See. Very often it feels when we have these panels at UN headquarters that we're very far away from the people that the policies affect. But I think in this case, it's pretty clear that we are right at the heart of where these policies are operational, right here in New York City. When I worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta at Kalighat, her home for the dying, one of the things they tell me and all the volunteers who go home, she would say, now go home and find your own Calcutta in your own home and in your own family. I think when we leave UN headquarters today and we see people on the street here in New York City and our neighbors here in New York City, we'll have a better sensitivity, awareness, and sympathy that many of them are the folks that we're talking about here today. So thank you to the group of the Friends of the Family for convening this, for sponsoring this. Thank you to CFAM. Thank you, Excellencies, for presiding here and for the delegations who are here and all of you who took the time and to pay attention. And also, thanks to our speakers who stayed on time. That was amazing. Thank you, and this concludes our event.